paper is part of an ongoing larger project. So at different conferences, I'm presenting bits of that project in the hope that one day there will be a book there, but we'll see. So I'm very open to questions, and also apologize that I go through some substantial things very rapidly, in part to give background to those of you in this audience, but also to the larger Armenian audience who may not know much about the current debates on questions of values and objectivity in science. And then final apology, any rubbish I say will be put down to my unexpected clash with the invisible door. I have the perfect excuse to say whatever comes to my mind. So this paper aims to play two major concerns in philosophy of science, the question of trustworthiness and the question of objectivity, against each other, and then hopefully address a potential tension between them. So I start with the role of trust in science. There are many different accounts of trust. I like to emphasize two. One is the predictive account, which says that to trust someone is to form an expectation that that person will behave as agreed or required by a given situation. So Harding very famously was behind that account. And then the normative account of trust, which claims that to trust someone is to form an expectation about how the person you trust ought to behave. So Annette Bayer was the main figure behind that account, but also many others have followed suit. Karen Jones is one of my favorite writers on that account, Faulkner, Darwell, who was mentioned earlier, and Holton. I think the normative account has very definite strengths because, as Bayer said, trust justifies feelings of betrayal and not just disappointment when trust is broken. So the predictive account does not invoke this sense of betrayal. Also, trust commits us to expectations of goodwill or benevolence. Almasi, Bayer, Cogley, Frost-Arnold, Whithold, everyone says that in different ways. And many people in this conference also have made that point. And then this is emphasized by the fact that the truster is counting on the trustee to act as expected. So this is Faulkner and Hawley. So in line with many other philosophers working in this area, I think that the normative account of trust is in a better position to capture our basic intuitions about what it is to trust and what it is to be trustworthy. Now let's look at trust in science. In general, trust is called for when we rely on or collaborate with or learn from others. Division of cognitive labor in all societies, but particularly in advanced Western and non-Western societies in 20th and 21st century, and also our epistemic and practical dependencies on others underpin the genuine need for epistemic trust. I'm going to come back to this division of cognitive labor because it's going to be an important point right at the end of my talk, so I'd like you to hold on to that idea if possible. So what about trust in science? I think trust is relevant to science in two ways. Usually these ways are distinguished from each other. I think they can be run together actually. So firstly, there's internal trust among scientists. Science, as we all know, is a collaborative social enterprise, and scientists need to rely on their colleagues' findings without double-checking everything. Of course, we want replication. Replication is needed, but you can't replicate every result. So you do need to have trust among scientists. But trust in science and the scientists by the public, or what I would like to call external trust, is also needed as a societal requirement. Firstly, because of the increased emphasis on policies that are based on science advice, and secondly, because scientists require trust from the public. And this point is sometimes forgotten. Scientists need public funding, as well as private funding. They need to recruit experimental subjects. They need to receive planning permissions for their labs. They need to permission to conduct experiments. So if they don't have the trust of the public, these activities will not happen. Both external and internal trust in science can be wrapped up in almost a tautology, that scientists and the general public should trust only trustworthy science. That goes without saying. But I am saying it because the real question is what makes for trustworthy science, and how are we to understand the idea of scientific trustworthiness. So let's just look at the broad picture first, and then I'll look at some of the more detailed issues. Broadly speaking, these are the characteristics of trustworthy scientists. They have expertise. So this is a cognitive desideratum. They know what they are doing. They hold great many true beliefs in the area relevant to their expertise. That's how Goldman talks about it. But you know, even if you don't agree with Goldman, you know what I mean by this idea of general epistemic or cognitive expertise. Secondly, there is a moral requirement, which Honora O'Neill captures it as integrity, that scientists should not, and good scientists will not knowingly mislead their interlocutors. They'll have honesty and transparency. And then, so that's the ethical requirement, and then there is a societal requirement that his scientists should have credibility. They should be providers of true or correct information. And that point, that third point, credibility, brings in both in expertise and in the integrity, plus some other societal factors. So now let's take a look at the predictive account of trust in science in some greater detail. I haven't included everything, but here are some of the features of trustworthy science according to the predictive account. Trust in science, according to this account, involves confidence in the information provided and the justified expectations of accuracy. It involves counting on the reliability of any predictions that scientists might make. It involves ascriptions of credibility to not only to the scientists, but to the sources of information that they rely on. And more generally, there is expectations of achievement of epistemic goods, such as knowledge, justified beliefs, understanding, best explanation, etc. So to sum up this point, in other words, trust in science involves an expectation that scientists will deliver the intended epistemic goods of science. And this account applies both to external trust and internal trust, that is trust within science and trust of science by the public on the predictive account. One of the problems that we have been discussing in this project and throughout the world is the idea or the danger of the breakdown of trust. On the predictive account, science has the means of self-regulation through peer review, through checking procedures, etc. Even in the 18th centuries, good science was done by the gentlemen, so that was a way of checking things, and you were supposed to be willing to engage in duels if you were an honest scientist. So on the predictive account, science can self-regulate, so any breakdown of trust should be applicable to outside factors, for instance, commercial interest, merchants of doubts, as Naomi Oreskes has famously called climate deniers, and the tobacco industry would exaggerate disagreement, give credibility to contrarian views, etc. Also, one point that the predictive account emphasizes is the knowledge deficit of the general public. This goes back to the point that Roland was making during the question session in the session 1, that well, you know, the population has the duty to be educated, and we have, maybe educational bodies have a role in doing this. So Stefan Lewandowski, who is part of the Peritia project, has emphasized this point. I don't agree with that. Many of us in Peritia disagree with the knowledge deficit model, but that's an argument for another day. And then a third external factor is the populist politicians' efforts to undermine the role of experts, simply because they do not wish to have intermediaries in their direct relationship with their people. So that's part of populism. Expertise does not play any role, or should not, according to populist leaders, should not play any role because of the direct connection with people. However, my worry is that the predictive account is not adequate. Particularly, it does not address worries about the breakdown of trust in science on normative grounds. perfect example is vaccine hesitancy or even vaccine denials among minority groups, with good reasons. But more generally, the predictive account does not consider the role of normative and value judgments in science. Why are values relevant to science? So I'm going to mention very quickly two reasons why values are important to science. One argument goes back to Quine and the argument from underdetermination, but Longino has made a lot of this point in that evidence never fully or adequately supports theory, so scientists need to use their judgments to make a final call on the acceptability of a theory. So what counts as an acceptable risk or acceptable theory is a normative judgment, and values, including judgments about moral issues, are inevitably involved when deciding what counts as sufficient evidence. This is not Quine's point, but it's Longino's point. The relevance of values to science is crucial when it comes to trustworthy science in the public realm. A second argument that has been repeated a lot around the table, at various meetings here, is the argument attributed chiefly to Heather Douglas, but actually it comes from Hempel, as Douglas herself acknowledges that scientists never have conclusive proof for their scientific theories or complete evidence for their hypotheses. Therefore, there is always some uncertainty regarding scientific knowledge. Scientists are taking risks. When they are taking risks, they do and should go beyond values. So far, I have concentrated on the predictive account of trustworthy science and then have pointed out to some issues there. But what is the normative account of trustworthy science? According to the normative account of trustworthy science is not only reliable in its predictions, but also takes the vulnerabilities of those affected by its application into account. Trustworthy science recognizes the leap of faith or the risk that non-scientists take in trusting science by being benevolent in its conduct of science. Trust in science is fragile, according to this view, because of its sensitivity to circumstances of those who are expected to trust it. So breakdown of trust in science often comes down to doubts about the goodwill of scientists and not just the epistemic grounds outlined in the predictive account. And Silvia Panizza, another Silvia in our project, and I wrote an article about that, about justified distrust for inquiry, which we hope will come out sometime this year. That's all and good, I suppose. Many people here would agree with it, I suspect. But I see a problem with what I have said so far, in that this normative account of trustworthiness clashes with the value-free ideal and the ideal of objectivity of science. The aspiration to be objective or to go beyond our local and personal interests, I think, and I agree with many others in this area, is one of the strengths of science. If you look at the history of development of science, actually it was a very progressive move to emphasize objectivity. It wasn't a regressive move by a bunch of white dudes. It really was an advancement in our cognitive capacities and intellectual awareness of how to advance knowledge. The thick normative account of trustworthiness, because of its emphasis on the value-ladenness of science, may seem to violate the requirement of objectivity. So, as I mentioned, the idea of objectivity has a long history. Some people trace it back to 1950s. I don't think that's right. The the ideal of science goes back to the beginnings of modern science. And it's informed by a number of considerations, so it has several grounds. So on the metaphysical grounds, that science attempts to study a mind-independent realm, and therefore the socially and humanly created domain of value has nothing to do with science. Then methodological ground, again, Hempel is the person, and also many other logical positivists. The scientific method of theory assessment does not leave room for values. So it's not just that you shouldn't bring in values. There's no room for values. Instrumental grounds, allowing values in science will be detrimental to its effectiveness. Norms and values will affect evidence and in some cases would trump them, and that would be bad news. Values, because values vary between cultures and historical periods, and they're also connected sometimes with personal or sectional interests, so their injection will affect the neutrality and universality of science, which is what science wishes to achieve. Science wishes to be cosmopolitan, not local. And then the emotivist view that Macmillan rejects the role of value in science. Ernest Macmillan, famous philosopher of science, because he thinks that there is no reason to think that human emotionality is a trustworthy guide to the structures of the natural world. Those who believe in the objectivity of science are prepared to make a couple of concessions. They agree that ethics is indeed relevant to science, but at the stage of how you make scientific discoveries, but also scientists should be aware of ethical issues when they are training students, when they are giving credit, or when they are trying to avoid fraud, etc., or conflict of interest. A second concession made is that norms are also relevant to science, but the gaps I mentioned earlier, gap of underdetermination and gap of inductive risk, can be filled readily by epistemic values. We don't need to bring in thick moral values. So Ivan Kuhn, for instance, said that accuracy, consistency, scope, simplicity, and fruitfulness is all we need in order to make choices between rival theories. And let's concede that values are integral to science. We have another problem. There's no guarantee that a value-laden science will be trustworthy. We need value-laden science plus good values. Otherwise, just saying that science is value-laden may be really bad news, because values might be based on prejudices, biases, etc. Okay, so I'm diagnosing a tension between the desideratum of objectivity and trustworthiness in this text says. Can we find a solution to it? Well, there are three accounts in the literature, I think. One is the traditional account, people like Larry Lawden, Lacey, etc. They say that, well, you know, objectivity of science in the traditional sense is good enough. That's all we need. So I'm not going to deal with that. I don't think ultimately that will satisfy many people just now. Then there's the anti-objectivist account, a very radical account, which says that the whole ideal of objectivity is a regrettable legacy of a male-dominated, exclusionary and oppressive epistemic stance. So the account itself should not be trusted. You give up on objectivity. And then thirdly, the revisionary account by feminist epistemologists that I'm going to mention, who think that objectivity should play a role in science, but we need to revise somewhat the account of objectivity. So I'm going to very briefly assess the two versions of the revisionary view, but what I say will also apply to cases where people deny the value of objectivity altogether. So the first feminist epistemology who wants to revise the idea of objectivity that I would like to mention is Naomi Sherman. And she thinks that trustworthiness is the same thing as objectivity. Note here that she and Longino, who is the next philosopher I'm going to consider, use an epistemic criterion of objectivity, very similar to Rorty, rather than a metaphysical criterion of objectivity. So it's an anti-realist version of objectivity rather than a realist version of objectivity. Pragmatists take an anti-realist view of objectivity as well, but they don't deny it. So Sherman says what we label objective has actually to do to be worthy of our trust and the trust of a diverse range of others. And again, scientific investigation will be trustworthy, meaning that those results will be credible not only to the scientists who came up with them, but also to others who may not share their particular experiences, biases, perspectives, interests, and the like. And Helen Longino very famously has given 4 conditions of objectivity, of this revised view of objectivity, identity. I'll go through them very quickly. That there's a recognized venue for criticism of the results of science. The community as a whole, that is scientists and non-scientists, should engage and be responsive to the criticism being put on the table. There should be shared standards for this criticism, and that participants should be granted equal intellectual authority, and that's the major point. What I claim is that the common point between these two accounts is what I call epistemic egalitarianism. And very briefly, in the last few minutes, I'm going to argue that epistemic egalitarianism does not work when it comes to science. So here are my worries, just 2 slides. Epistemic egalitarianism goes against one of the main motivations for epistemic trust, i.e. the division of cognitive and epistemic labor mentioned earlier. We need epistemic trust exactly under those conditions where there is unequal authority because of specialized knowledge. Longino, for instance, requires that there should be shared standards for criticism, but this is very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve under conditions of inequality in knowledge and expertise. Those of you who know the debates about knowledge and expert divide would be aware of the problems there. You know, if someone is novice, by definition, they don't have equal access to the epistemic resources of the experts. That sort of epistemic egalitarianism goes against the idea of expertise and also will really obviate the need for trust. If you're epistemically equal, if there's no division of epistemic labor, why should we even bring the notion of trust? We don't need to rely on each other for knowledge. We just sort of are all equal there. So in addition, I think we will impoverish our intellectual life and cognitive achievement as a society if differentiated cognitive achievements were not acknowledged and allowed. So, finally, benevolence, as we have argued, is a requirement of normative trust, but that should be distinguished from epistemic egalitarianism. Trustworthy science is governed by epistemic norms that are judged credible by those with expert and specialist knowledge. To deny this is not only to reject the objectivity of science, but also the very idea of science as a source of expertise. However, the requirements of expertise do not clash with the requirements of benevolence when understood as goodwill and due concern for the welfare of those affected by scientific activities. Benevolence, however, and this is something that Levy, for instance, and Helen de Cruz have discussed, benevolence, however, should not be assumed but ascertained outside of moral and epistemic bubbles. So just to think that climate scientists who say that there is climate change are benevolent, no, that would not work. That really would not work, because they are part of our epistemic and moral bubbles. We need to open up the conversation. So I think Longino is right to suggest that we need venues for discussing, criticizing scientific views and results, but their guiding principle should not be epistemic egalitarianism, but parity in expectations of epistemic and ethical reliability on the part of the experts. That is, joint reliability between ethical and epistemic factors can give us normative trustworthiness. Thank you very much. And that's my acknowledgement to our funders.